Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do a quick video to introduce the next chunk of lessons dealing with parameters and return values. Okay, we'll kind of take care of the explore and the investigate, kind of 7.1 and 7.2 in one shot here. Okay, objective to read through functions with parameters and return values. Let's figure out what the heck those are now. So as long as we're talking about functions, let's remind you what our definition of a function was. We said it was a named group of programming instructions. So we take some lines of code, we wrap them up within a function, and then we're able to call that lines of code by calling that function's name wherever we want in our program. Okay, why would we want to do this? Well, it helps avoid repeated code, it simplifies our code, and if you learn anything about programming from this course, repeated code bad, functions good. So now moving on to parameters then, I'm going to say a parameter is a piece of information passed into a function. Okay, I'm also going to say that we've been using parameters pretty much this whole course, we just haven't been calling them that. For example, if I call the function setScreen, it takes a parameter screen ID. Okay, the ID is what we pass into the function to let it know what screen we want to set. Or for example, we have a function called append item for appending things to a list, which has two parameters. We tell it which list we want to pass the item to, and then what the item is, and then it passes it to the correct list. Okay, both those are cases of parameters that we pass into the given functions. So we've basically been using function parameters this whole time now. The big difference today is we're going to write our own functions that utilize parameters. Now to do that in code.org, if I'm starting off with a function, notice there is a little arrow I can click to expand things. When I click on that, what I'm going to end up with is a function with a space for a parameter. And if I want to click the arrow again, I'd get a function with a space with two parameters. Okay, so really I can have as many parameters or as many pieces of information passed into these functions as I want. So when it comes time to make a function with the parameters, basically our steps are the same as just with regular functions. We will define the function. So for example, let's say I make this function, all right, height 2 meters. I want to make a function that takes a height in feet and inches and converts it to meters. So my two parameters would be the feet and the inches. And I'll do some math here. I'll say total feet equals feet plus inches divided by 12, basically converting my inches to feet. And we'll say meters is equal to total feet divided by this 3.28084. That's just my conversion factor. And then this function is going to log the meters here. Okay, so define my function utilizing these parameters. And essentially when I make parameters, it's like I'm making local variables that I can use within these functions. It's kind of the same thing as saying var feet and var inches. I have two variables I can use within that function. Okay, once it's defined then, I can call the function. So for example, we could say height to meters 5.6. That's going to convert 5 feet 6 inches to meters, and it would print to the console 1.6764. And then the nice thing about a function with parameters like this is I don't have to store those feet and inches as some other variables. I can just keep calling this function, and each time I do with a different set of parameters, I'm going to get a different output here. Other thing we'll talk about then today is the idea of a function's return value. I'm going to say a return value is a value sent back by a function to the place in the code where the function was called. Now again, we've already been using some functions that have return values, such as the random number function, which returns to us a number between a min and a max. Okay, or the getText function, which is going to get the text, it's going to return the text, okay, from whatever ID we put in. And now typically with return functions, we don't just call them by themselves. Okay, I could have these two lines of code just floating around randomly in my program, but if they run, we're not going to see anything. Usually what we do with return values is we actually attach them to some kind of equal sign. So we'd return the random number and save it as a variable called num, or we could return what's in this drop box, the text, and save it as a variable called word. Okay, so they return them to the spot in the code that we called them. So like we just said, when you use the return, you're able to specify a single value that will be returned to whatever code called the function. And kind of why we name it the way we do is if we're running through this code, when JavaScript gets to this line, num1 gets double it with a parameter num1 passed in, it's going to go find that function call, double it here. It's going to run the code with num1 passed in, so my output will be set to num1 times 2. Okay, times 2, that's the double it part. And then we'll return that output. Okay, so it's going to take that value and return it to this line before it moves on to the next one. Okay, this is a quick example that shows why we'd want to use return statements. Now, I could write functions where the function deals with the specific variables I want to double, but it's a lot easier and it's a lot more general to write a function that takes in a parameter and then outputs a return value, and then I can call it on as many variables as I want rather than having a different function for each variable. Let's talk about another quick return example. Okay, so when you call a function, the computer runs a piece of code elsewhere in the program, then returns to the point of the code where the function was called. And then specifically as far as the return command goes, this little chunk of code right here, we'd say the return command tells the function to stop executing immediately. Okay, so now typically what we'll have with a return is something to actually return and send back. But it is okay just to call return. That's a way to kind of stop a function in its tracks. So if I called this function, when it runs, this line of code always runs, so it would print that to the console. But since my return comes before my other stuff, okay, this one never does. That's why I'm getting the error message here. JavaScript's recognizing that I won't be able to get to that part of the function, okay, because we're going to return before it. All right, so then just to sum things up, you can think of the parameters as the input for the function, what you put in, whereas the return values are the output, what the functions spit back out once they're done running. Okay, then we're talking about parameters and return values, but as far as what we have to have, what functions can have, they can have no parameters and no return values, so you don't have to use those. They could have a parameter but no return value, a return value but no parameter, or they could have both parameters and return values. All right? Let's jump over to code.org and see this stuff in action. So first thing we'll take a look at is the lesson 1, the parameters and return explorer. Now really there's nothing in this lesson besides a quick question, and we can run through that together. Okay, it asks what will print to the console after running the code segment. So we have our function numbers that takes in two parameters, num1 and num2. And I'm calling it with the values of 3 and 2 for my arguments that I'm passing in. Now, like I said, usually return functions are set equal to something, or we can just print them off like we're doing here. So when I pass 3 and 2 in, we have a new variable being constructed called answer. We're going to set answer equal to the sum of 3 and 2. Okay, so again, those num1 and num2 kind of act like local variables. In this case, they are 3 and 2. Okay, so in other words, answer is 5. Then we'll say answer gets answer plus num1, which is a 3. So 5 plus 3 is 8. And then we'll return answer times num2, which is 2. 8 times 2 is 16. That's where, boom, we're getting the answer from right there. So next, let's jump into the investigate in lesson 2. And this is another short one, just 2 quick sample apps we'll take a look at. And let's see what we have here. Number Cruncher app. Let's hit run. It says enter 2 numbers and then click the symbol to calculate. So let's say I have a 5 and a 2. If I click on the plus, it's going to add those together for me, display that, and then it says the answer is an odd number. Okay, let's go with 5 and 2 again. This time let's click the minus. Okay, so now it subtracts. Once again, we have an odd number. And then I'm going to go with the same 5 and 2, and let's go times. This time we get a 10 out because it multiplies, and it says we have an even number. Okay, how is this app working? Well, let's see here. Looks like there's an on event for the add button, minus button, multiply button. That'd be these 3 buttons here. And this is some pretty simple looking code. All that those buttons are doing is they're setting my output label, okay, which I'm assuming is, let's reset it, this label right here. Yep, I see it in the background. We'll run and get an example in here again. The output label to a function call to calculate with a different string passed in for the plus, minus, and multiply. Okay, so let's take a look at what that calculate method does. Well, it takes a parameter, that's our symbol. It's going to get the numbers from my 2 inputs and store them as number 1, number 2. And then what it does is it goes through and it checks if the symbol is the plus, it's going to add those numbers together. Or else, if it's minus, if symbol equals minus, it'll subtract them. Or else, well, that's the last thing we can have, it's going to multiply them together. So if it's not the plus or the minus, it's got to be the multiplication. Okay, and then I'm going to skip down to the bottom, and then eventually it's going to return that answer. Okay, what is it setting answer equal to? Okay, so the answer then is all this. It's number 1 plus a space plus the symbol plus number 2. So what that's doing is that's creating this kind of display of the actual equation, and then it's returning that, okay, returning it to the output label and setting it to the answer given the symbol that was passed in. Okay, so that's what's happening here. All right, one other thing going on in this function. It's also setting this, looks like even odd label. And the way it's doing that, it's using an operator we haven't talked about yet, this percent side. That is the JavaScript and most programming language symbol for modulus. Okay, and what mod is the remainder when you divide. So when I take my answer in this case, which is 7, and I divide it by 2, I get a remainder of 1. Okay, that's not equal to 0. All right, so that's why I'm displaying the number as odd. If I did an even number, okay, such as the 5 and the 2 again, we get 10. Okay, 10 divided by 2 goes evenly. There's no remainder. Okay, so that's why we're able to say it's an even number. All right, as we get into the practice, there'll be a little bit better explanation of that. I don't want to spend too much time with it here. You'll get some practice with it. Okay, and you'll figure out what it is a little bit better. All right, so that's the way this app works. We've got a function with both a parameter and a return value, and it's using those 2 in combination to make this a pretty simple code, actually. Okay, as far as stuff you can do with this app, you can add the divide button, and also in addition to displaying if the number is even or odd, you can display if it's divisible by 3. Okay, well that's really not going to take much. You need another event handler. You would have to add on to our if-else with another else for the division. And then also you can add on to this if-else, okay, for answer mod 3 equals 0, okay, to check if it's divisible by 3. Okay, play around with this a little bit if you want to. If you break it, you can always go back with a version history and reset. Otherwise, we'll move on to the last example here. All right, kind of another fun one on bubble 3 here. When I click run, it gives me an A. And what I can do here is as I adjust the length of words I'm looking for, it's going to give me a bunch of words that start with the letter A and have a length of 4. Okay, or I could switch that to an F, and it's going to give me a bunch of 4-letter words. All right, good. There's no fun ones on there. We don't have to worry about that. That start with the F here. Okay, how is it doing that? Well, when the app begins, it makes a word list that gets the column from a data table called words happening in the background. And then it's also going to make an empty filtered list. And right off the bat, before I click any buttons, we're going to call this filter function that gets the length from the dropdown, and also gets the text from the dropdown, okay, as my parameters. And then when I click or when I change my length dropdown down to my letter dropdown, it just calls that same function on those two dropdowns there. Okay, let's take a look at what that function does. Well, there's two parameters, the length and the letter. It looks like it shows a waiting element and an unclickable element, so that was kind of the little timer we had there just for effect. And when the function's clicked, it clears out my filtered word list. And then what it's going to do is it's going to loop through the word list. And if word list at I has the same length as the length parameter we passed in, and word list at I dot substring 01, so in other words, the first letter is equal to the letter we passed in, it's going to add that word, okay, word list at index I to the filtered list. Okay, we got another chunk of code here. So if filtered list.length equals 0, it's going to say no options available. So for example, let's say we want a one-letter word that starts with, F. Okay, it doesn't exist, no options available for us. And then at the end, once that loop's all done, and there's a little bit of pause because I'm thinking this word list is pretty big actually, if there's noticeable time for when this loop runs. It's going to hide the waiting element, hide the unclickable element, and then show the text here, the new filtered word list joined together, and that's how we're getting basically a list, okay, all joined together there with commas in between. Okay, so not a return function. All this function does is essentially sets this output when it's all said and done, but it is utilizing parameters, and those parameters are my length input and letter input here. Okay, so kind of a neat use of functions there. What else can we do with this? If you want to, you can remove the letter dropdown and replace it with an input box. You can then update the code so that the user can type any number of letters in. So it's going to give you all the words that start with a certain set of letters. To make that adjustment here, you'd change this to an input box. You'd still use the get text, and I guess the big change would be this substring would change from 0 to 1 to 0 to the length, the len, in case you're getting 1 or 2 or 3 or however many letters you're looking for. Okay? Again, feel free to play around with this one. If you break it, just hit restart. But another fun look at functions here. All right, so there you go. There's our explore and investigate for parameters and return values, kind of all in one shot. We'll see you guys in class for the practice.